Christian Horner described Daniel Ricciardo's Monaco Grand Prix victory, against the odds really, as a comparable success to Michael Schumacher finishing second in the 1994 Spanish Grand Prix. Now, he didn't say 1994, he got his numbers wrong, but that's the race that he meant, and it sparked a lot of debate about which of those two drives was better. Now, we added to that debate, I think, when Ed, your race report went live yesterday, and it said that Ricciardo's drive eclipsed what Schumacher did. Not that many people agree with you, so we started a poll on the Autosport Twitter page, and that's still running as we record this, but we're at 69% think Schumacher's drive was better, 31% think Ricciardo. But Ed, this is an opportunity to just explain your perspective, and also the fact that I believe you and Ben Anderson, who's with us as well, have watched the 94 Spanish Grand Prix back. So this is as informed a debate as you're going to find about this, hopefully. But Ed, explain yourself to the masses.
Well, my first point is that I did write that it was in some ways eclipsing Michael Schumacher's drive. Now, I'll just explain the difference. I think Schumacher's performance in 94 in Spain was absolutely extraordinary. To stay in fifth gear, to maintain that pace, it was a remarkable driving challenge that he rose to. Ricciardo's was a racing challenge, in that Schumacher wasn't really racing people directly who were right on the same bit of track as him. Yes, Hill went past him, but he was powerless to pass him by that point. But when it came to Ricciardo, he had Vettel right behind him, and when the problem first struck, he lost 160 brake horsepower, had to make adjustments to the way he was driving, to the brake bias, keep the rear brakes under control. That period, many other drivers would have cracked. So it's just a different kind of challenge, both brilliant in their own way. But I think as a racing challenge, what Ricciardo had to do in Monaco was that little bit more difficult. He was racing, Schumacher was almost time trialling. Both did it brilliantly, though.
Now, before Ben and I jump on the bandwagon and tell you that you're wrong,
Who says there's a bandwagon?
Do you think that possibly maybe some people underestimate the challenge just of circulating around Monaco in a Formula One car at speed? So yes, Ricciardo had the advantage that he probably wasn't going to get overtaken if he could maintain a consistent pace, a consistent line, that sort of thing. But he still had so much to manage between the barriers. And I think until you see Formula One cars from trackside at Monaco, you really can't appreciate just how big the car looks in the middle of the road. So he's got no margin for error.
I'd agree with that, especially with the fact that to get the lap times he was getting, he was having to push harder than Vettel behind him. Two things, really. The challenge of driving at Monaco, as you say, I completely agree with that. And the second point is just the challenge of doing what he did. The challenge of doing what he did. Everybody can relate to being stuck in fifth gear from driving a normal car, except for those of you who favour automatics. But when it comes to losing power and winding brake bias forward and overheating brakes and managing all that, it's a little bit more nebulous and difficult to understand. But that was what made it a more multifaceted challenge in a way. The actual getting the lap times wasn't so difficult, but it was dealing with all that, particularly in the 1 or 2 laps when he was trying to get on top of the problem.
Now, Ben, there's no disputing that it's a great drive, and we're not trying to downplay the achievement of Ricciardo's win. But do you think that just Monaco now, particularly with the latest breed of Formula One cars, it's so difficult to overtake? Did that take away a lot of maybe the risk, and it did perhaps give him a bit more time to work around those problems and get a feel for it? Because we eventually ended up in a situation where Vettel had to back off because he couldn't sit under his rear wing for that long.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ricciardo was protected by two things. Firstly, the track layout, accepting that Monaco is an extraordinary driving challenge, and that is part of what elevates Ricciardo's performance anyway, but it did protect his position. His race was effectively won before the problem struck. He controlled the first part of the race. It was a go-slow race. He was controlling the pace. He nailed the first pit stop, his only pit stop, came out in the lead. Then the problem struck. There was no way that Vettel was going to pass him. And yes, he lost the horsepower, but on that kind of circuit, that's where horsepower hurts you the least if you lose it. If Ricciardo was on any other of the modern F1 circuits, he wouldn't have won that race. So I think ultimately, if you look at Schumacher's race, I think being stuck in fifth gear is so difficult to drive the car in one gear around a circuit like Barcelona, especially given in 94 that layout had the special emergency chicane inserted.
Oh, the horrible tyre chicane, of course.
Absolutely, yeah, in response to the problems they had earlier in the season with safety. And if you watch the onboard graphic of Schumacher around that circuit on Eurosport, they had the gear map on that graphic, and There were 7 turns, I think, on that circuit that he had to use second gear or lower ordinarily. And to do the pace he did in 5th gear, one of the worst gears he could have been stuck in, really, I thought was extraordinary. Ricciardo had 6 of his 8 gears still available. He stopped using 7th as part of managing his problem. So I think all he really had to do, accepting it was difficult for him to adjust initially, was just stroke it home. As long as he maintained that track position, he was never going to lose the race. Schumacher, I think, had a much, much tougher job on his hands given what happened to his car.
Now, Ed, looking at that 94 race, was Schumacher also helped by the fact that the Benetton had a big pace advantage over the majority of the field? Yes, he could do nothing about Damon Hill's Williams, but the spread of the field behind that, I think the top 4 cars in the Spanish Grand Prix that year were covered by the same sort of pace margin as the top 7 cars were in Monaco this year. So back then, was it just that there weren't enough competitive cars to make Schumacher's race more difficult?
To a point, although I think actually finishing position in both cases is less important than the overall drive, because let's say Mika Häkkinen had not retired with an engine failure, he might well have passed Schumacher for second, but that wouldn't have reduced Schumacher's quality of drive, because it's all, and we've got the lap times here, the lap times he was doing were absolutely
Well, how much did his pace drop off?
Well, there's this phase, it's just after the first pit stop, where he's doing kind of 1 minute 31s and 1 minute 29, 1 minute 30, and then it doesn't take him too long to get back into the 1 minute 27s, which is a pretty decent pace around there. So he's experimenting with lines and keeping the momentum up, etc. There's a few things really, because, for example, Ben, you mentioned that 5th gear is in some ways the worst gear to be stuck in, but actually I was reading a piece, Willem Turt, who was at Benetton, right, I think it's available on LinkedIn if you search for it online. And he said actually 5th was the only gear that was going to be achievable in, because 4th he wouldn't have had the pace in the straights and would probably have blown up the engine, and a higher gear 6th would have just not quite worked. Doesn't mean it wasn't brilliant, because you had to keep that momentum up and you can hear him blipping the throttle to keep the revs, etc. But it's just a slightly different kind of challenge. That's why I keep saying it's a pure driving challenge. But you know what he did, he wasn't that far behind Hill by the end. Okay, Hill didn't have to push, but there was a gap to. There was a reasonable amount of time and gap to play with, but that's less relevant to me than the driving performance. If he'd just gone and done 50 laps at that pace on a test day, stuck in 5th gear, it would be just as impressive an achievement, frankly.
I think it's extraordinary also that Schumacher was able to do some occasional laps quicker than Hill, even with only 1 gear available. I just think that's remarkable on that kind of circuit. With Ricciardo's drive, I just feel like in the modern era, he's got a bit more help in terms of managing settings. The way the engines are configured now, there's a bit more management they can do in terms of isolating things when they go wrong. Yeah, he had to make the brake bias adjustment. I think that was quite important. I don't think Schumacher really had as much help. It was more about what he could do behind the wheel in terms of keeping momentum going, keeping his speed up. And if you watch some of the laps from that race, he's really struggling with the car. He's getting many wobbles on in certain corners as he's trying to keep the momentum up. Ricciardo, I don't think he really had to change too much in the way he drove the car. Yeah, he had to adjust the settings, but he still had 6 gears available. He still drove, I think, normally. He just had to make some small
Christian
adjustments.
Horner actually said, didn't he, that he pushed too hard to begin with, and the problem first struck. Ricciardo was obsessed with how fast can I go in the corners to try and build some gap, and then I think he calmed down and maybe realised that, well, I'm still not going to get overtaken, and then it became about, as you said, managing brakes and everything else. But there was that brief moment where I think he thought, right, I've got to get everything out of this Red Bull chassis to try and keep me away from the cars behind. And the initial radio chatter between Ricciardo and the team sounded really defeatist, I thought. It did. There were a few moments, for a couple of laps there, you did think this is race over.
But I think what Ricciardo did that was impressive, it was he had that intense pressure. Schumacher did have a little bit of time to play with. Doesn't make any less brilliant what he did, but Ricciardo had to instantly respond. So 1 minute, you're doing your thing, you thought, good, I've got through the pit stop phase, I've got this Monaco Grand Prix won. Then that happens. You've got to process all of this, adjust what you're doing, and obviously the point where he was most vulnerable would have been into the chicane, which is the one place if you are going to pass, it could happen. It would have been so easy, particularly when moving the brake bias around, just to make a mistake, to run deep, to give Vettel a chance, just to let him get on top of him. And I think it's those few laps. What happened after, once he got it all settled, fine, that was a more straightforward task. But in the intense, white-hot heat of competition, to do that and not have that little bit of breathing space to make a mistake, I think was exceptionally good.
Yeah, I'd have to agree that what Ricciardo did mentally was outstanding. I think the pressure he was under, especially given how difficult Monaco is mentally for the drivers anyway, was outstanding. I think probably overall, Ricciardo's race was probably the mentally more impressive, and Schumacher's maybe the more technically impressive in terms of the adjustments he had to make inside the cockpit. But both outstanding drives. We're splitting hairs really, trying to say which one is better than the other. I would say also I felt that Ricciardo was probably protected a little bit by the fact that Vettel was having problems in his Ferrari in terms of managing the tyres. It seems that new suspension they're messing around with isn't working quite as well as they'd hoped. And I wonder if things might have been different had Vettel been having a more normal race of his own. But we'll never know.
I think this is the important thing. They're both exceptional drives. When I made that claim, it created lots of social media argument as if I was attacking what Schumacher did.
Is one good and one bad. The vote here is, of these two amazing drives, which one do you prefer? And some people said to us, how can you even ask this question? The majority of those are Michael Schumacher fans. But 31% have voted for Ricciardo's drive. So it's clear that there is a debate here. It's not black or white. And that's because, these are two world-class drivers doing phenomenal things that normal people can't do.
Yeah, and I think plenty of drivers would have perhaps lost control mentally at Monaco and maybe slipped a place or at least given a real chance to Vettel.
Because Vettel hit a barrier.
Well, yeah, exactly. Vettel did get half a second off at one stage, so there was a chance there. And I think that's the important thing. They are both great drives, but for me, Ricciardo's was a racing challenge, even at Monaco. Schumacher's was a technical driving challenge. Different challenges, different reactions, both two phenomenal drivers.